What if Europe's first superpower never fell? To answer that, we have to go back to that afternoon in 1600 BCE and look much more closely at what the tsunami actually did, and just as importantly, at what it didn't do. Because the popular version of this story, the one where a single wave erases an entire civilization overnight, turns out to be wrong in a genuinely interesting way. The ground trembled first. Small tremors, then stronger ones, rattling storage jars off their shelves across an island in the Aegean. Then, one afternoon around 1600 BCE, the volcano at the island's heart detonated with a force greater than almost any eruption in the last 10,000 years. The center of the island collapsed into the sea. Ash climbed into the stratosphere, and somewhere out in the Aegean, a wall of water began racing toward the coast of Crete, toward the largest, most advanced civilization Europe had ever built. You've probably heard some version of what happened next. A tsunami swept in, and in a single catastrophic afternoon, wiped an entire civilization off the map. But before we get to what actually happened, you need to know who these people were, because almost nobody is ever taught their name. 3,500 years ago, the most advanced civilization in Europe wasn't where you'd expect. Not in the Greece of marble temples and philosophers you picture from history class. That Greece wouldn't build the Parthenon for another 1,000 years. It was centered on Crete, at the southern edge of the Greek world, and you have almost certainly never been taught its name. The Minoans. They had running water, flushing toilets, multi-story buildings with light wells and earthquake-resistant timber framing, paved roads, a writing system, a navy so dominant that their cities didn't need defensive walls because nothing on the sea could touch them. While most of Europe was living in scattered farming villages, the Minoans were building palace complexes with thousands of rooms, importing ivory from Egypt, copper from Cyprus, and painting their walls with dolphins, saffron gatherers, and processions of young men vaulting over the backs of charging bulls. Picture it for a second because it helps explain why the fall matters so much. Imagine a coastal town where three-story houses line paved streets, where women walk to communal wells past walls painted floor to ceiling with swallows chasing each other through fields of red lilies, where young athletes, both men and women according to the frescoes, train for a sport that involved grabbing the horns of a charging bull and vaulting clean over its back in front of a cheering crowd. That is not artistic fantasy. It's a documented, repeated image across Minoan sites, painted with the same casual confidence you'd paint a modern sports match. This was a wealthy, sophisticated, outward-looking world, sending ships as far as Egypt and the Levant, centuries before most of the Mediterranean had anything resembling a city. And then, within a few generations, they were gone. So the eruption didn't exterminate the Minoans in one blow. What it did instead was slower, and in a way, crueler, because it wasn't over in an afternoon. It unfolded across generations. Tsunamis generated by the collapsing island tore across the Aegean, and geologists have traced their debris slamming into the northern coast of Crete, the Minoan heartland, wrecking harbors, fleets, and coastal settlements in a matter of hours. Excavators have found thick layers of marine sediment, shells, and pumice shoved far inland at several Cretan coastal sites, sitting exactly where you'd expect if a wall of seawater had once come through and receded. For a civilization whose entire power rested on ships and open sea trade, that was the equivalent of severing an empire's arteries all at once. The ash cloud, falling for days afterward, disrupted agriculture across the region. Trade routes that had run for centuries faltered and in places simply stopped. And modern research, including work by the archaeologists John Dreesen and Colin MacDonald, suggests what followed wasn't sudden collapse, but a long, grinding unraveling. Decades of economic strain, social instability, and slowly declining influence. The Minoans survived the eruption. What they couldn't survive was everything the eruption started. Because weakness, in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, never went unnoticed for long. Within roughly 150 years, the Mycenaeans, the rising military power of mainland Greece, the culture that would later be remembered as Agamemnon's people, the warriors of the Trojan War legends, had moved into Crete and taken over. The palaces burned or quietly changed hands. Minoan writing, a script scholars still call Linear A and still cannot fully read, gave way to the Mycenaean adaptation known as Linear B. Europe's first great civilization didn't die in a single afternoon. It bled out slowly, weakened by a disaster it survived, and then someone else finished the job a century and a half later. Now run the experiment. Remove the eruption entirely. The Minoans in 1600 BCE were not a civilization in decline. They were at their peak, expanding influence across the Aegean islands, with art, architecture, and seafaring technology far ahead of their neighbors on the mainland. Europe's first superpower simply keeps sailing. And here's where it gets genuinely strange to sit with. Almost everything you were ever taught to call the birth of Western civilization runs directly through the Mycenaeans, not the Minoans. The Mycenaeans are the Greeks of Homer. Their own collapse centuries later, and the long dark age that follows it, eventually leads to Athens, to Sparta, to the philosophy and the democracy and the alphabet you are reading right now through its Greek ancestor. That entire chain of inheritance begins with the Mycenaeans stepping into a power vacuum that a volcano helped tear open. No eruption, and that vacuum may never open at all. The dominant culture of the Eastern Mediterranean stays Minoan, a civilization that, as far as archaeologists can piece together, was strikingly different from what eventually replaced it. Minoan art overflows with nature rather than warfare. Dolphins, octopuses, saffron crocuses, joyful festival processions, and, remarkably for the Bronze Age, women shown in prominent central roles, priestesses and goddess figures dominating their religious imagery in a way that has no real equivalent in Mycenaean art. Their major towns, as already noted, went essentially unwalled for centuries, an almost unthinkable choice for the era. Compare that to the fortress citadels, the death masks, and the warrior graves the Mycenaeans left behind, and you're looking at two fundamentally different templates for what European civilization could have been built on top of. Would a Minoan-descended Europe have been more peaceful, more mercantile, less obsessed with martial glory? Honestly, no historian can promise you that with a straight face. But the founding template matters more than we like to admit. The stories a culture tells about itself at the very beginning echo forward for thousands of years, and the foundational stories of Western civilization came down to us from the side that happened to win. There's one more twist. The eruption's date isn't even settled. Egyptian records place it near 1500 BCE. Ice cores and tree rings place it over a century earlier, near 1620 BCE. That's a full human lifetime of disagreement about the most important event in Aegean prehistory, and nobody has won. Maybe that's the strangest part of this story. You were never taught the Minoans' name. Even the people who study them closest can't agree on the year their world came apart. If stories like this interest you, subscribe. There's a new one buried here every few days. You were taught Western civilization began with the Greeks, but before them, there was a superpower on the sea, one that fell not because it was weak, but because a mountain exploded at exactly the wrong moment and never fully recovered. Every civilization after grew up in the space it left behind. The real question was never why the Minoans vanished. It's how different your world might look today if that mountain had simply never exploded.